Richard, a successful millionaire, unexpectedly crossed paths with a fragile young girl, Lauren, on a frigid, snowy day in Washington, D.C. The city buzzed with its usual energy, but the icy wind slicing through the air made everything feel harsher. Richard, immersed in thoughts about an upcoming business meeting, moved briskly through the streets. Known for his unyielding determination, he was a man perpetually burdened by unseen weights. As he approached a bustling intersection, something unusual drew his attention. A young girl, her frame tiny and her clothes threadbare, sat shivering on the frozen pavement. In front of her, a small, worn plastic cup rested forlornly. Her large eyes, dull with exhaustion, tracked the hurried footsteps of strangers passing by. They held a quiet resignation mingled with a faint glimmer of hope. Richard rarely allowed himself to notice the world outside his carefully structured life. Yet this moment was different. A strange, inexplicable ache pressed against his chest. He tried to avert his gaze, but something rooted him to the spot. Before he fully understood, he had stopped right in front of her. "Hello," Richard said, his usually commanding voice now softened by concern. "What's your name?" The girl hesitated before lifting her gaze. Her voice, barely audible above the city's din, trembled as she answered, "Lauren, sir." Richard felt an unexpected wave of emotion. He prided himself on his logic and composure, but something about Lauren's fragile presence broke through his usual defenses. "Why are you out here, Lauren?" he asked, his voice low, already fearing her reply. "I'm cold and hungry," she murmured, her head dropping in shame. Richard stared at her for a long moment. Memories he had locked away for years stirred faintly in the back of his mind. Without another word, he crouched beside her, extending his hand. "Come with me," he urged. "Let's get you someplace warm, and I'll find you something to eat." Lauren hesitated, her small hand hovering in uncertainty. She had heard promises before, ones that turned hollow. But there was a sincerity in Richard's voice that gave her pause. Slowly she reached out, letting him lead her away. Later, in the comforting warmth of Richard's home, he spoke gently. "Are you feeling better now?" Lauren gave a faint nod, her eyes cast downward. "Yes, sir. Thank you for everything." The formality in her tone tugged at Richard's heart. It was a shield, a barrier she had built to protect herself from a world that had shown her little kindness. "You don't have to call me Sir Lauren," Richard said, his voice softening. "My name is Richard. You can talk to me. I'm here to help." Lauren hesitated, clutching the blanket tightly as though it were her only anchor. Richard could see the internal battle waging within her. She wanted to speak but feared what might come out if she did. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, she took a shaky breath. "It's been so hard since my dad left," she whispered. Her words tumbled out haltingly as she described a night filled with shouting and tears, followed by her father's sudden departure. He had taken her with him, only to abandon her days later in the unforgiving city. As she spoke of her parents' bitter arguments and her father's cruel words claiming her mother didn't care, tears welled up in her eyes. "But I don't believe him," she added, her voice breaking. "I can't believe him." Richard listened intently, his chest tightening with every word. The pain in her voice struck a deep chord, resonating with memories he had long buried. His own father, Mr. Carl, had wielded words like weapons, shaping Richard's life with unrelenting expectations. He pushed those thoughts aside, focusing entirely on Lauren. "I'm so sorry, Lauren," Richard said softly, his tone heavy with sincerity. "No one should have to go through this." Lauren wiped her tears with the edge of the blanket. "It's not your fault. I don't even know why you're helping me, but thank you." Richard offered a small, reassuring smile. "I'm helping you because you deserve it, Lauren. You deserve to feel safe and cared for. I promise, no matter what, I'll do whatever it takes to make sure you're okay." For a moment the room was enveloped in stillness. The faint hum of the heater provided the only sound, filling the space with an almost tangible quiet. Lauren's gaze searched Richard's face, her wide eyes brimming with a cautious hope. She seemed to be looking for something, perhaps a reason to trust, or maybe a hint of reassurance. Whatever she found softened her expression. After a lingering pause, she nodded, a fragile, tentative smile breaking through her tears. "Okay," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Richard felt a surge of emotion, one that gripped his heart and left him momentarily breathless. Relief mingled with determination, solidifying his resolve. He had made a promise to Lauren, and he intended to honor it. Yet, as he watched her small figure curl up on the couch, another thought began to take root. It wasn't enough to offer her temporary safety. To truly help Lauren, he needed answers about her mother, about the life she had been torn from, and about the truth that lay hidden between her parents. Only then could he hope to provide her with the stability she deserved. But even as the idea grew in his mind, a heavy weight accompanied it. Richard couldn't ignore the possibility that uncovering the truth might lead to something far more painful than either of them expected. Still, there was no retreat. He had stepped into Lauren's life, and abandoning her now was unthinkable. "Lauren," he said, his voice soft yet resolute, breaking the silence. "I'm going to help you find your mom. We'll figure this out together, I promise." Her eyes widened, flickering between fear and hope, like a flame struggling against the wind. "Do you really think we can find her?" she asked, her voice trembling. Richard nodded, his expression steady. "I do, and I won't stop until we do." As he spoke, a deep determination settled within him. This wasn't just about helping a vulnerable child anymore. It was about confronting the shadows of his own past, about healing wounds he had long ignored. Perhaps in helping Lauren find her way, he could also find a path to peace for himself. Outside, the streets of Washington, D.C. fell silent as night descended. The once bustling city now seemed almost serene under the faint glow of streetlights. Inside Richard's apartment, the atmosphere had shifted. Lauren lay asleep on the couch, her tiny frame cocooned in a warm blanket. Her breathing was steady, yet the faint trace of sadness on her face remained, even in her dreams. Richard watched her quietly, the weight of her story pressing heavily on his mind. The situation struck a chord within him, stirring memories he had buried deep. Sitting in his armchair across from Lauren, he felt the past creeping in, unwelcome and relentless. He closed his eyes, willing the memories away, but they flooded back with unyielding force. His mind drifted to his childhood, to the grand estate where he had grown up. It was a place that should have been filled with warmth and comfort, but for Richard, it was anything but. The long, echoing hallways seemed to carry only harsh words and unmet expectations. His father, Mr. Carl, loomed over every corner of that house, even when he wasn't physically present. Richard could still hear his father's sharp voice, cold and uncompromising. "Don't let me down, Richard. You have to be the best." Anything less is failure. Those words had followed him like a shadow, shaping every decision he made. Nothing was ever enough. And on a report card was met with questions about why it wasn't an A. Winning a race meant being reminded there was always someone faster. Love wasn't the driving force in Mr. Carl's world. It was control, unyielding, relentless control. Every part of Richard's life had been meticulously molded to fit his father's vision of perfection. Opening his eyes, Richard felt his chest tighten, the familiar pang of anxiety clawing at him. Even now, years later, his father's words held the power to sting. He had spent a lifetime trying to escape that shadow, building his wealth and success as proof that he could thrive on his own terms. But in doing so, he had paid a price he was only beginning to understand. Looking at Lauren, still asleep on the couch, a new question gnawed at him. Had she been judged the way he had? Had she been made to feel inadequate, as though she were never enough? The thought made his jaw clench. Her parents, those meant to offer her unconditional love, had let her down, just as his father had failed him. Anger flared within him, not just at her circumstances, but at a world that allowed children like Lauren to suffer. But with the anger came resolve. He couldn't undo his own past, but he could change the trajectory of Lauren's future. He could give her what no one had given him, the reassurance that she was enough, just as she was. Quietly, he whispered to the room, as though speaking directly to her sleeping form, "You are enough, Lauren, just as you are." Richard's words to Lauren echoed in his mind, "You're enough, just as you are." Yet, as the hours ticked by, he couldn't quiet the collision of memories with the present. He paced the dimly lit room, his thoughts tangling with the weight of his past. The countless arguments with his father, Mr. Carl, resurfaced, each one leaving scars that never quite healed. Those moments when Richard had wanted to speak his truth, but had been paralyzed by the fear of confrontation, haunted him. He remembered all the times he had stayed silent, swallowing his opinions, terrified of the consequences. But one night stood apart from the rest, carving itself into his memory with painful clarity. He had been just 12 years old, sitting stiffly at the dinner table. His father had launched into yet another lecture about the family business, emphasizing how one day Richard would inherit it. "You'll need to learn sacrifice," Mr. Carl had insisted, his tone unyielding. As usual, Richard had sat quietly, enduring the words, until his father said something that struck a nerve too deep to ignore. "You have to be ruthless in this world," Mr. Carl declared, his voice cold and firm. "Compassion is weakness. Success demands that you keep your emotions out of it." Something inside Richard had cracked. For the first time he dared to look his father in the eye, his voice trembling with a mixture of fear and defiance. "But what if I don't want to be like you?" he blurted out, the words spilling from him before he could stop them. A heavy silence fell over the table. Mr. Carl's piercing gaze locked on his son, his face unreadable. Slowly he set down his utensils, folding his hands deliberately on the table. "Excuse me," he said, his voice dangerously calm. Richard's heart pounded in his chest, but he didn't back down. The weight of his father's expectations pressed against him, but so did the desperation to finally be heard. "I don't want to be ruthless," he continued, his voice quieter now but unwavering. "I don't want to hurt people just to succeed." The pause that followed was suffocating. Finally, with a slow, icy smile, Mr. Carl leaned back in his chair. "You're weak, Richard," he said, his words laced with disappointment. "And that's why you'll never be good enough." Those words had stayed with Richard, shaping every decision he made. From that night forward, he vowed never to let weakness show. Vulnerability became his greatest fear. But now, standing over Lauren as she slept, Richard felt the walls he had built around his heart begin to crumble. The defenses that had once shielded him now seemed more like chains, keeping him from truly connecting with others. He took a deep breath, allowing the memories to wash over him instead of pushing them away. If he was ever going to help Lauren, he needed to confront his past. He couldn't guide her toward healing if he hadn't faced his own ghosts. As the first rays of dawn crept through the windows, Richard's resolve solidified. Finding Lauren's mother wasn't just a task, it was a necessity. It wasn't only about reuniting Lauren with her family, but also about freeing himself from the pain he had carried for far too long. Richard stepped toward the couch where Lauren lay, her small body tucked snugly under a blanket. She stirred slightly as he adjusted the covers, mumbling softly in her sleep. He lingered for a moment, watching her peaceful face, a swirl of emotions flooding through him: sadness for her struggles, hope for her future, and determination to make things right. "Rest well, Lauren," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "Everything's going to be different." He turned away, his footsteps heavy but purposeful. The day ahead held uncertainty, but it also held promise. Richard braced himself for the challenges to come, knowing they were unavoidable. By helping Lauren, he hoped to find the peace he had been searching for all his life. The first light of dawn spread across the Washington, D.C. skyline, bathing the city in a golden glow, but Richard barely noticed the beauty around him. His thoughts were fixed, his mind racing with one singular goal: finding Lauren's mother. Richard had spent the morning glued to his phone, calling in every favor and leveraging the extensive network he had built over the years. His goal was clear: to uncover any lead about Rose, a woman from a chapter of his life he thought he had long closed. The task felt strange, almost intrusive, but he knew it was necessary. Lauren's future depended on it. His search brought him to a neighborhood on the outskirts of Washington, D.C., one that had clearly seen better days. The area bore the weight of time, with faded buildings and streets that seemed to echo the stories of a once thriving community. Peeling paint clung stubbornly to old walls, and rusted metal fixtures adorned window frames dulled by neglect. The quiet stillness of the streets carried a sense of abandonment, a lingering melancholy that seeped into Richard's thoughts. As he walked, a knot of unease began to tighten in his chest. He was treading on ground he wasn't sure he wanted to disturb. This wasn't just about finding someone, it was about reopening a part of himself he had tried to forget. Yet, despite the uncertainty gnawing at him, he pressed forward. Arriving at the address he had been given, Richard stopped in front of a dilapidated apartment building. Its exterior was a mix of cracked brick and rust-streaked fire escapes. The stained windows seemed to whisper stories of hardship. He stood there for a moment, inhaling deeply, trying to steady himself. Facing intimidating CEOs and navigating high-stakes negotiations had never fazed him. But this was different. This was personal. Summoning his resolve, he pushed open the creaky front door and ascended the narrow staircase to the second floor. Each step groaned under his weight, amplifying the tension in his mind. Finally, he reached apartment 2 billion. The door was ajar, revealing only shadows within. He hesitated for a beat before knocking lightly. "Rose," he called out, his voice low but carrying through the quiet hallway. "Rose, it's Richard. Are you there?" The silence that followed felt endless, stretching seconds into minutes. Then, slowly, the door creaked open a bit wider. Standing before him was a woman who looked as though the years had taken more than their share from her. Her disheveled hair framed a face etched with exhaustion. Her clothes were simple, worn from time and struggle. But it was her eyes that struck Richard the most. They held a profound sadness, a heavy kind of pain that had settled in long ago, refusing to leave. The sight of her stirred something deep within him, a mix of guilt, regret, and a longing to understand the story she carried. Rose stood there silently, her gaze meeting his, as though trying to decipher his intentions. In that moment, Richard realized how much life had changed her and perhaps how much it had changed him as well. "Richard," Rose asked, her voice laced with surprise and uncertainty. "What are you doing here?" Richard stepped forward, his heart pounding in his chest. It had been years since he last saw Rose, not since they had parted ways after high school. Even after all this time, there was no mistaking her. She was the same woman he had once loved, though the years had clearly left their mark. "I'm here about Lauren," Richard said softly, though his tone carried an unshakable resolve. "She's in trouble, Rose. She needs you." At the mention of Lauren's name, Rose's eyes widened, and a flicker of panic crossed her face. Without hesitation, she pushed the door open fully, silently inviting him inside. The apartment was small and sparsely furnished, bearing the signs of a life lived on the edge of struggle. Richard took in the surroundings, noting the worn-out furniture and the bare essentials that filled the room. It was clear that Rose had been doing everything she could to get by. As she moved, the weight of her hardships was evident in every step, every gesture. "Is she okay?" Rose asked, her voice trembling as she closed the door behind him. "I thought she was with her father." Richard nodded, though his expression remained grim. "She was, but he left her." "Rose," he continued, his words deliberate, he abandoned her with nothing. "I found her yesterday, begging for food. She's scared and she needs you. She needs her mom." Rose sank into a chair, her face growing pale as guilt and shock washed over her. "I didn't know," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I had no idea he would do that. I thought at the very least he'd take care of her." Her words trailed off, regret settling heavily in the room. Richard studied her closely, searching for a sign of how she was processing the news. He could see the pain etched into her features, the weight of her mistakes hanging visibly on her shoulders. Yet, amidst the sorrow, there was something in her eyes, a flicker of hope. "Rose," he said gently, pulling a chair to sit across from her. "I know things haven't been easy for you, but Lauren needs you now more than ever. She's been through so much, and she's terrified. She needs to feel that she's not alone, that someone still cares about her." Tears welled up in Rose's eyes, spilling over as she choked on her words. "I've made so many mistakes, Richard. I thought I was doing the right thing for her, but I failed her. I let her down." Richard reached out and placed his hand over hers. "It's not too late, Rose. You can still be there for her. We can figure this out together." For a long moment, Rose didn't respond. She simply stared at their hands, lost in thought. Eventually, she let out a shaky breath and gave a slight nod. "You're right," she murmured, her voice filled with a fragile determination. "I have to do this for Lauren." Relief washed over Richard like a wave, easing the tight knot that had formed in his chest. This journey was far from over, and the road ahead would be anything but smooth. But Rose's willingness to try was the first step, a glimmer of hope. "I'll take you to her," Richard said as he stood, motioning for her to follow. "She's safe at my place, but she's been through a lot. Seeing you will mean the world to her." Rose rose from her seat, her movements hesitant, as if each step toward what lay ahead required courage she wasn't sure she possessed. "I don't know," she said quietly, her voice trembling with doubt. "I don't know if she'll even want to see me after everything." "She will," Richard replied firmly, his tone steady and unwavering. "She's your daughter, Rose, and right now she needs you more than ever." As they left the apartment and made their way to his car, Rose walked in silence, her thoughts a maze of guilt and uncertainty. Richard stayed quiet, understanding that she needed space to process everything. The drive back to Richard's apartment was heavy with an unspoken tension, a quiet that clung to the air like a storm waiting to break. Glancing over at Rose, Richard noticed her hands tightly clasped in her lap, her knuckles pale with strain. "Rose," he said gently as he parked in front of his building, his voice low and calm. "You've got this. Lauren needs to see that you're here for her." Rose exhaled shakily, giving a faint nod. "I know," she whispered, her voice trembling with emotion. "But I'm terrified, Richard. What if I let her down again?" "You won't," Richard said, his tone firm but reassuring. "What matters is that you're here now. That's everything." Together, they stepped out of the car and started up to the apartment. Each step seemed to grow heavier, laden with the weight of unspoken fears and long-buried emotions. Yet Richard felt certain they were moving in the right direction, towards something that could finally begin to heal the wounds of the past. When they entered the apartment, they found Lauren sitting on the couch, her small frame slumped forward, eyes unfocused on the flickering television. The moment the door creaked open, her head turned, her expression shifting from disinterest to wide-eyed surprise. She froze when she saw Rose standing in the doorway. "Lauren," Rose said softly, her voice hesitant, almost fragile, as though she couldn't fully believe what was unfolding before her. Slowly, she stepped closer, her hands trembling. "It's me, sweetheart. I'm here." For a moment, Lauren didn't move. She stared, her face a tangle of disbelief and longing, as though she were trying to determine if this was real or some cruel dream. Then, in an instant, the uncertainty gave way. She leapt from the couch, sprinting into her mother's arms, her sobs breaking the stillness of the room. Rose knelt to hold her, wrapping Lauren tightly in her embrace. Tears streamed down her face as she whispered soothing words, stroking her daughter's hair and murmuring apologies laced with love. "I'm here, my darling. I've got you now. I'm not going anywhere." Richard stood back near the doorway, a witness to the raw, powerful moment unfolding before him. His chest tightened with emotion, the enormity of what he was seeing nearly overwhelming. This reunion, this fragile but profound connection, was only the beginning of a long, difficult journey. Yet, in that instant, he allowed himself to feel a small, flickering hope. Maybe, just maybe, they could find a way forward together. The apartment was quiet, save for the soft murmur of Rose soothing Lauren. Her whispered reassurances blended with the faint hum of Washington D.C. sounds filtering through the windows. Richard stood a few steps back, giving them space, though his heart was firmly tethered to the moment. Watching Lauren cling to her mother, tears streaking her small face, stirred a mix of emotions in him, both foreign and achingly familiar. After a few minutes, Rose gently guided Lauren back to the couch. They sat close, their hands clasped tightly together. Richard lingered nearby, his thoughts racing. He had come to help Lauren reconnect with her mother, but now a deeper unease gnawed at him. Something in the air felt unresolved, something that didn't quite make sense. Lauren tilted her head up toward Rose, her voice trembling. "Mom, why did Dad leave me? Was it because of me?" Rose's face tightened with sorrow as she pulled Lauren closer, her arms wrapping around her protectively. "Oh, sweetheart, no. You didn't do anything wrong," she said softly. "Your dad made a terrible choice. None of this is your fault." The weight of her words struck Richard squarely in the chest. He had always prided himself on his ability to stay detached, his knack for compartmentalizing emotions to stay focused on solutions. But now, something about this moment unraveled him. It wasn't just the words Rose spoke, it was the way her gaze shifted when she looked at Lauren, as though she carried a truth she wasn't ready to share. Rose's eyes lifted to meet Richard's, and for a brief moment, gratitude flashed across her face. But there was something else, something far more complex lurking beneath the surface. Her hesitation was palpable, and after a long pause, she finally broke the silence, her voice trembling with uncertainty. "Richard," she began, her tone unsteady, "there's something I need to tell you, something I should have said a long time ago." The room seemed to grow heavier as her words lingered in the stillness. Richard's heartbeat quickened, his mind whirring through a dozen possibilities. He could see the strain in Rose's expression, the way her hand clutched Lauren's like it was the only thing keeping her grounded. "What is it, Rose?" he asked, his voice calm though his insides churned. Rose inhaled deeply, her eyes darting between Richard and Lauren as if searching for the courage to continue. "Richard," she said at last, her voice barely above a whisper. "Lauren's father isn't who you think. He's not some man I met after high school. He's you." For a moment, time seemed to halt. Richard stared at her, the weight of her words pressing against his chest. Everything he thought he knew tilted on its axis, leaving him struggling to find balance. "I'm Lauren's father," he asked, his voice so soft it was barely audible. Saying the words out loud made them feel startlingly real. Rose nodded, tears pooling in her eyes. "Yes, Richard, she's your daughter," Rose admitted. "I found out I was pregnant a few months after that night we reconnected. But by then you were already off at college and I didn't know how to tell you, so I didn't." A flood of emotions surged through Richard's: shock, anger, disbelief, but most of all, an overwhelming sense of loss for the time he had unknowingly missed. His gaze shifted to Lauren, who was looking at him with wide, uncertain eyes. "Dad," Lauren's small voice broke the silence, layered with both hope and fear. Richard knelt down in front of her, his hands trembling as they reached for hers. "Yes, Lauren," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm your dad. I didn't know before, but I know now. I'm so sorry I wasn't there for you. But I promise you this, I'm here now, and I'm not going anywhere." Lauren's wide eyes searched his face, as if trying to find the truth in his words. Slowly, she leaned forward, wrapping her tiny arms around his neck. Richard held her close, his chest swelling with a love so deep and immediate it left him breathless. This was his daughter, his child. The realization shook him to his core. Rose stood nearby, tears streaking her cheeks as she watched them. Despite her guilt and regret, there was relief softening her expression. The secret she had carried for so long was finally in the open. "I'm so sorry," Richard, Rose whispered, her voice breaking. "I should have told you sooner. But I was scared I didn't know how you'd react. And then, everything became so complicated with Lauren's other father, the one she thought was her dad." Richard glanced at Rose while still holding Lauren. "I understand, Rose," he said, his voice steady with a new determination. "But now that I know, everything is going to change." He hugged Lauren a little tighter, silently vowing to make up for all the lost time. The road ahead would be difficult, but for the first time Richard felt a glimmer of hope, one that came from the profound bond between him, his daughter, and the woman who had kept this secret for so long. Together they would find a way forward. The apartment was still, save for the faint murmurs of Rose comforting Lauren. Her soft reassurances blended with the distant hum of Washington D.C. streets beyond the windows. Richard took a step back, giving them room, though his heart remained tethered to the scene before him. Watching Lauren cling to her mother, tears cascading down her cheeks, stirred a storm of emotions both foreign and achingly familiar. After a while, Rose gently guided Lauren back to the couch. They sat close, hands entwined like a lifeline. Richard lingered nearby, his mind racing. He had come to help Lauren reconnect with her mother, but now a deeper unease gnawed at him. Something unspoken lingered in the air, a truth he couldn't quite grasp. Lauren's trembling voice broke the silence. "Mom, why did Dad leave me? Was it my fault?" Rose's face twisted with sorrow as she held Lauren tighter, her voice breaking as she replied, "Oh, honey, no, you didn't do anything wrong. Your dad made a terrible choice, but none of this is your fault." Hearing those words, Richard felt a pang deep in his chest. He had always considered himself a man in control, capable of keeping his emotions at bay. Yet, this moment unraveled him. It wasn't just Rose's words, it was the way she looked at Lauren, as if burdened by a truth she hadn't yet revealed. Rose's gaze lifted to meet Richard's, her expression a mix of gratitude and something far more complicated. After a long pause, she spoke, her voice trembling with hesitation. "Richard, there's something I need to tell you. Something I should have told you years ago." The air grew heavy as her words settled between them. Richard's heartbeat quickened, his thoughts spinning with possibilities. He could see the fear in Rose's eyes, the way her hand tightened around Lauren's, as though drawing strength from her daughter. "What is it, Rose?" he asked, his voice steady, though his nerves were anything but. Rose inhaled deeply, her gaze shifting between Richard and Lauren. "Richard, Lauren's father isn't who you think. He's not just some man I met after high school. He's you." Time seemed to stand still. Richard stared at her, his mind struggling to process the weight of her revelation. It was as though the foundation of everything he knew had been shaken. "I'm Lauren's father," he finally whispered, his voice barely audible. Saying the words made them real. Rose nodded, tears brimming in her eyes. "Yes, Richard," she said, "she's your daughter. I found out I was pregnant a few months after we reconnected. But by then, you were off at college and I didn't know how to tell you, so I didn't." A flood of emotions overwhelmed Richard's: shock, disbelief, anger, and an immense, unnameable sorrow. His gaze shifted to Lauren, who was looking at him with wide, uncertain eyes. Dad, Lauren's small voice trembled with both hope and fear. Richard knelt before her, his hands shaking as he gently took hers. "Yes, Lauren," he said, his voice breaking. "I'm your dad. I didn't know before, but I know now. And I'm so sorry I wasn't there for you. But I promise, I'm here now, and I'm never leaving." Lauren's wide eyes searched his face, as if trying to decipher the truth in his words. Slowly she leaned forward, wrapping her small arms around his neck. Richard held her close, his chest swelling with a love so deep it left him breathless. This was his daughter, his child. The realization was both shattering and profound. Rose stood nearby, her tears streaming down, though her expression held a glimmer of relief. She had carried this secret for so long, and now, at last, it was out in the open. "I'm so sorry," Richard, Rose whispered. "I should have told you sooner. I was scared I didn't know how you'd react. And then everything became so complicated with Lauren's other dad, the man she thought was her father." Richard looked at Rose, still holding Lauren tightly. "I understand, Rose," he said, his voice resolute. "But now that I know, everything changes." Hugging Lauren closer, Richard vowed silently to make up for the years he had missed. The road ahead would be challenging, but for the first time in a long while, Richard felt hope. Between him, Lauren, and Rose, a new chapter was beginning, a chance to rebuild together. When Richard arrived at the Grand Estate's entrance, he took a deep, steadying breath. He knew this confrontation was long overdue. Inside, his father, Mr. Carl, waited in the study, a room steeped in the scent of leather and cigars. As Richard stepped through the doorway, the weight of his past seemed to settle heavily on his shoulders. Mr. Carl sat behind his imposing oak desk, his expression inscrutable, though his sharp eyes bore the same air of judgment Richard remembered from his youth. Richard, his father, greeted coolly, not bothering to rise. "What brings you back after all these years?" Richard shut the door firmly behind him, his fists clenched at his sides. "I'm not here for pleasantries," he said with quiet force. "We need to talk. There are things that have been left unsaid for far too long." His father raised an eyebrow, the barest hint of amusement flashing across his face. "Oh, and what might those be?" Richard stepped closer, his frustration simmering beneath the surface. "You know exactly what I mean. You controlled every part of my life. You set impossible standards and made me feel like nothing I did was ever good enough. I spent my entire childhood trying to meet your expectations, and no matter how hard I worked, it was never enough." Mr. Carl remained calm, his voice as detached as ever. "I pushed you because I saw your potential, Richard. I wanted to ensure you didn't waste it. And look at you now, a successful man, a millionaire. It seems my methods worked." "Your methods," Richard shot back, his voice tinged with disbelief. "You didn't push me, you crushed me. I spent years trying to live up to your idea of who I should be, and in the process I lost sight of who I actually was." For the first time, Mr. Carl rose from his chair, moving deliberately around the desk until he stood directly in front of Richard. "So that's what you believe," he said, his voice laced with challenge. "That I meant to destroy you? No, Richard. I made you tougher. You learned how to survive in a cutthroat world. You put success above feelings, and that's how you thrived." Richard shook his head, a bitter laugh escaping his lips. "Thrived? I barely lived. I shut myself off from everyone. I was so afraid of showing vulnerability because I thought it would prove you right, that I wasn't the perfect son you demanded." His father's gaze hardened, his voice sharpening. "And what are you now, Richard? Some sentimental fool who thinks emotions will get him ahead. Is that what this is about?" "This isn't about work or success," Richard snapped, his frustration spilling over. "It's about family. It's about knowing what it means to truly care for someone, not as a tool for achievement, but because they're a part of you. I have a daughter now, and I won't make the same mistakes with her that you made with me." Mr. Carl's expression faltered for the briefest moment. "A daughter?" he asked, his tone softer, though tinged with doubt. "Yes, a daughter," Richard said firmly. "She's my entire world. And I refuse to raise her the way you raised me, always feeling like she's falling short. She'll know she's loved for who she is, not just for what she can do." For a long moment, silence filled the room. Mr. Carl's gaze locked onto his son's, the tension between them palpable. Finally, his shoulders sagged slightly, and a faint sigh escaped him. "Perhaps I made mistakes," he admitted, his voice low. "I thought I was doing what was best, what would make you stronger. But maybe I was wrong." Richard blinked, stunned by the admission. This was a man who had never once acknowledged his faults, and now he stood before Richard vulnerable for the first time. "I don't need your apologies," Richard said, his voice softening. "But I do need you to understand that things are different now. I'm not that scared little boy anymore. I'm a father, and I'll raise my daughter my way." Mr. Carl nodded slowly, the corners of his mouth twitching into a faint, rueful smile. "You've grown, Richard. You've become your own man, I suppose. That's all I ever truly wanted." For the first time in his life, Richard felt a sense of closure. The hold his father had wielded over him for so long was finally slipping away. He hadn't become the man Mr. Carl had tried to shape, and that realization no longer felt like failure, it felt like triumph. Without another word, Richard turned and walked out of the study. With each step he took, the weight of his past lifted just a little more. By the time he reached his car, he felt free, ready to move forward with the family he had vowed to protect, knowing he was finally leaving the shadows of his childhood behind. As Richard drove back toward his apartment, back to Lauren and Rose, a rare sense of calm began to settle over him. He had taken the steps he needed to, finally confronting the shadows of his past. Now he could turn his attention to what truly mattered, building a secure and loving future with his daughter and the woman he had once loved so deeply. When he opened the door, Lauren was the first to greet him. Her face lit up, her smile as bright as sunshine, as she ran toward him. Richard bent down to scoop her up, holding her close. For the first time in what felt like forever, he knew he was exactly where he belonged. "We're going to be okay," he murmured softly, almost to himself. "We're going to be just fine." For the first time in years, he believed it. In the days following the confrontation with Lauren's former guardian, an uneasy calm hung in the air. Despite the man's absence, Richard couldn't shake the feeling that this peace was fragile, like the calm before a brewing storm. The man's chilling words, "You haven't seen the last of me," echoed relentlessly in Richard's mind, serving as a constant reminder that the danger wasn't yet behind them. Rather than let fear paralyze him, Richard used it to fuel his resolve. He would do whatever it took to ensure Lauren and Rose were safe.